All right, we will get underway presently. Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone here in the Mills Room at the Chancellery building of the AEMO, and welcome everyone who's joining us online from many different places. My name is Jotzo. I'm the head of energy at the AEMO Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions, and I'm also an academic at Crawford School of Public Policy here at AEMO. So today we've gathered to take a close look at Australian and United States decarbonisation strategies and opportunities, and to really the goal is to deepen the dialogue and perhaps open up some new lines of communication as well, and some mutual learning as well will certainly come out of this event. Before we get formally underway, I would like to acknowledge that we're on Ngunnawal land. So Ngunnawal people here, the Canberra region, are the traditional custodians of the land. So we pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and of course also acknowledge that other participants in our meeting are on other First Nations lands. So today we will cover a whole range of things: emissions reduction options, economic implications, social implications, and potential trajectories towards net zero and the way forward for both countries. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers, and we will also have ample time for discussion after our four presentations. Very briefly, by way of background, most of you will be aware of all of this, but let me reiterate anyway. The United States now have a national emissions reduction target of 50 to 52% by 2030 and a net zero commitment for 2050. That's a significant change, of course, from the previous administration, but at the same time, there's some extent of constancy also in policy at the subnational levels, cities, states, companies as well. Australia's national emissions target is officially 26 to 28%. However, the revised NDC spells out very clearly an expectation that that target will be exceeded with a reduction of up to 35%. Labour Party in opposition has announced a 43% reduction target for 2030 as part of its election platform, and likewise, of course, Australia has a net zero target. Australia's emissions are now around about 20% below 2005 levels. That's practically entirely accounted for from reductions in emissions from land use change and forestry. Electricity sector emissions have fallen every year since 2016, so that's a very solid trend. All other emissions combined, however, over that period since 2005 have increased somewhat. And so what that points to is enormous opportunity that has only to a small extent been tapped so far. Many differences, of course, between our two countries, but also very many similarities and commonalities. So some of the similarities or parallels are the importance of decarbonizing the electricity sector, huge opportunities to do so, and the beginning of that journey has been made, as is visible in the rapid rise of renewable power in both countries. Large producers of fossil fuels, both countries, of course, which poses obvious difficulties in economic transitions, in particular in fossil fuel-rich parts of the countries. Challenges, but also opportunities in industrial decarbonization, manufacturing, heavy industries. Importance of the transport sector in the overall emissions inventory, and overall importance of the agriculture sector in the economy as well. And also, of course, an oftentimes difficult politics of climate change, especially at the federal levels. And finally, I put on that list an emphasis on technological solutions for climate outcomes. And so it's for those reasons and for many others that we think it makes sense to collaborate, to cooperate, including in research analysis to inform policy choices and implementation. So that's the spirit of the event that we've organized here today. The event is very generously supported by the Embassy of the United States in Australia and by the State Department, And it's part of a project that will allow us to do some research, draw in some of our postgraduate students in internships, and to provide some relevant analysis early in the new year. That's the plan. Our workshop, you've noticed this, is in a hybrid format. I've mentioned it at the beginning. There's about 15 or so of us here at AEMO at the Chancellery, and then quite a number of people online. And we're certainly planning to have a good integration of the discussion across the people in the room and online, including in the United States. So what we'll do is we'll hear our our 4 presentations, and then move on to discussion after the presentations. And very briefly, our program will be kicked off by Douglas Sonnek, who's the economic counsellor, then Leon Clarke and Nate Hultman from Maryland and the State Department, then Rachael de Hosson from the Department of Industry, Science, Energy Resources, and then Nicola Falcon from the Australian Energy Market Operator, 10 minutes each. Co-convener of the symposium is Dr. Tom Longden, my colleague, who closely cooperates on many of these things. And with that, over to our first speaker, Mr. Douglas Sonnek. He is the economic counsellor at the US Embassy here in Canberra. He oversees the overall management of the economic section and is the primary liaison with the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia, and also the point of contact for topics regarding the US-China economic relationship. Please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jotzo. And welcome, good morning to everyone here in the room and here watching in Australia. Good evening to our colleagues in America or late afternoon. It's fantastic to have the opportunity to provide just a little bit of context for the 4 great speakers that are coming up in the near future here. We have found ourselves, I think, just a few weeks after COP26, assessing the challenges and the opportunities that are in front of us. This is important to us at the US Embassy and the US government because, as expressed in President Biden's trade policy agenda released in March of 2021, putting the world on a sustainable environmental and climate path is one of just a handful of key economic and strategic interests of the United States. So those of us in DC or here in Canberra are asking ourselves the question, how did COP26 help that? And what do we do next? And we're doing this all against the backdrop of the news here in Australia, where we read about the incredible floods that have been happening, or back in the United States, where the terrible tornadoes of the weekend are foremost in our mind. And while no single climate event, weather event can be traced back to climate change, it is clear that warming temperatures lead to more extreme weather events. And this is at the 1.2 or 1.1 degree level. So we are beset with even more urgency now than ever, recognizing, I think as COP26 did, that the Earth is warming and there are dire consequences if we do not act to meet the Paris Agreement's goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. So what did we accomplish at COP21? Well, the US objectives going in were very much to increase ambition to reduce emissions. They were to translate that ambition into action. They were investing in the technologies that will allow us, enable us to get there. And they were focusing on raising funding around adaptation and mitigation for those countries that are already feeling the impacts of climate change. And if we look at that as a marker, countries representing 65% of global GDP set 2030 nationally determined contributions in line with 1.5 degrees. That's 154 countries that put forward new plans to cut emissions. And more than 200 parties to the Paris Agreement agreed on the need to strengthen commitments after Glasgow to reach that 1.5 degrees goal. Secondly, COP26 saw a lot of actions on the margins of deforestation, reducing methane emissions, or even encouraging investment in clean technologies. And thirdly, the US, China, the People's Republic of China and the United States committed to work together to enhance action in this critical decade with the aim of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. China committed to developing a comprehensive plan for methane emissions reduction this decade and began to talk about ways that they can reduce the use of coal. Outside of the Glasgow process, outside of the federal process, our states and our cities and our companies are doing tremendous work as well to push forward toward net zero commitments and the like. So people are really asking more of governments, of companies, and of us. So we ask ourselves then, what is the way forward? And this is, I think, what we'll hear from our four great speakers today. But our leaders are speaking about this continuously. And most recently, Foreign Minister Payne and Secretary of State Blinken over the weekend were talking about this amongst the many issues that they raised in their discussion in Liverpool. But they have affirmed that, COP has affirmed that all countries, especially the advanced economies, need to do more to tackle this crisis. And as a major source of greenhouse gas emissions, Australia and the United States are front and center in this discussion. Australia is well positioned, of course, to develop and profit from the steps moving toward a net zero economy, including renewables, hydrogen, electric battery materials, supply chains, and critical minerals, which are key to so many of the technologies that we will need to meet our net zero goals. Investing in green economy also promotes jobs, productivity, and the economic growth that will build on Australia's competitive advantage around industries like modern batteries, if properly managed. And finally, it's easy to see Australia's role as a global leader in the low-cost solar technology and renewable energy. So pulling this back to the US-Australia relationship, just last week in our energy security dialogue, these were the topics that our two governments are discussing day in and day out, those details that will help us get to the goals. And so I think we will hear from our four speakers, from Professor Clarke, from Professor Hultman, Rachael de Hosson, and Nicola Falcon, about the specifics of how we move along toward these goals. And it is something I'm very much looking forward to. So thank you, Professor Jotzo. Thank you to all of the speakers. And I'm so looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you very much. You've certainly given us a good start to our discussions, and the emphasis on new energy industries in Australia, including for export, is of course also a strong point of interest for ANU-based research, and in fact ANU investment in research capability. All right, let's get started. Our first talk is from Professor Leon Clarke. He's a research professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy and also research director of the Center for Global Sustainability there. He's also a research scientist at the Joint Global Research Institute, a collaboration between University of Maryland and Pacific Northwest National Lab. Leon is an expert in energy and environmental issues, focuses on climate change mitigation strategies, energy tech options, and integrated assessment models, and is spending quite a lot of his time also working with and for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I think you have a little bit of a breather from that right now, Leon. Great to have you with us here, and over to you.
Great. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Good. Great, good. And yes, I am happy to have a break from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change right now. So my setup is such that I will be looking in the other direction at times when I'm talking to you, just so you're aware, but hopefully that shouldn't be an issue. So I'm gonna start. I guess Nate and I are both going to discuss a little bit about the US. I'll start by giving a perspective on some of the research that we've been doing where I am, as well as a little more broadly. On how to think about mitigation in the US. And then I think Nate will give a perspective from his current State Department perch. So let me just start. So what I'd like to do is give a sense of what it means to get to 50 to 52%. And then I'd like to give some general comments about how to think about it and how to think about what it looks like, and then how do we actually get there. So first, let's just talk, see if I can get this to move, about what it means. So the US, and I think Nate will talk about this as well. But just to briefly note that the US is committed to 50 to 52% below 2005 and 2030. And you can think about it in the context of two other goals that have been in place, which was the previous NDC of 26 to 28% below 2005 levels in 2025, and the goal of getting down to zero by 2050 or before 2050. And this new goal of 50 to 52 is pretty much right on track for those. So a little bit more aggressive in some sense than off the previous NDC, but right on track to getting down to zero. So now let's talk a little bit about what it would take to do that. So there's been a whole range of studies in the US, and I apparently have automatic forwarding, which I will take care of on every slide. There's been a whole range of studies in the US that have looked at trying to reduce emissions, basically in two dimensions. There was a set of studies, actually, we were one of the few places that looked at it before the actual announcement came out, looking at trying to get down to 50% by 2030. But there's also been a number of studies looking more broadly and more, looking more long-term at getting down towards zero. For example, there's a large set of work from the Princeton group that's called Net Zero America, trying to get down to net zero. There's also been some other 2030 studies that have come out since the announcement. For example, I have one here shown by Rhodium Group, looking at getting to 50% by 2030. And of course, there's a new US long-term strategy, which I imagine Nate will discuss in just a moment. So there's been a set of studies and analyses that have been out there. And the question is then, what do they say? How do they differ? What's the same? And I'll first comment that in general, they have a set of common characteristics. They're not actually all that different. What they would be different about in terms of is what are the policy structures that are actually deployed to get down. But let me just go through some of the common characteristics about them. So first off, what you see across almost all of them is that electricity is core to this. The US still does have a coal fleet in electricity, and that provides a key opportunity for us to reduce emissions. So most of these studies get about 50% or more, some up to 60% of their reductions relative to 2005 from electricity. So it's really the backbone. And there's a reason then why you have the announcements from the president of trying to get down to zero by 2035 and so forth. This is the backbone of US emissions reductions. And that means getting out of coal, means holding on gas, getting out of gas eventually, but then moving heavily on non-emitting sources, renewables, potentially extending the nuclear fleet and so forth. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. Then second is transport is typically a large chunk. You might think about transport and electricity being sort of about 75%, 3/4 of the way between the two of them. So electricity is backbone, big chunk out of transport. And then what needs to happen is we need to eke out reductions across all the other sectors, industry, buildings, non-CO2s, particularly methane, of course, is a big play now. And then in the US, for those who don't know, has a very important land use sink. So we actually have a relatively large land use sink, and the character of that is critical for us, not only for the 2030, but also as we get down to 2050. So that's the general character of it. And then you can ask, well, what are some of the specifics that one might be thinking about? So here's a sampling of specifics coming out. Oh, sorry. By the way, I should note this is from one of our studies, but in general, this general character is pretty comparable across studies. So then you might ask, what are some of the specifics? And this is a set of results that we've seen coming out of our numbers or our analyses. And again, they're just not that different. So in electricity, you're talking about renewable power delivering about half of electricity by 2030. There's pretty much no coal by 2030. So you may still have some gas, which we need to move out of by 2035, but you pretty much have no coal. And so gas is substantially lower as well. So it's a pretty dramatic change in the electricity system. There's questions about what would precisely be it is that replaces the coal and gas. In general, it will be heavily renewable. coal, solar and wind, but there's also questions about lifetime extensions of nuclear, potentially bringing fossil with CCS and so forth. Then in transportation, here we have 65% of new cars and SUVs are electric, 10% of new trucks are electric. Here, the notion is moving on efficiency and then moving very aggressively on electrification of vehicle fleets. And if you went back several years, most folks would really have talked about only light duty, but now there's really a perception that we can make a great deal of progress actually in freight as well with electrification. And then going down, you can see all new buildings, 100% electric, almost all appliances are electric, cutting cement emissions, a lot of opportunities to reduce emissions from oil and gas, which would be consistent with the methane agreement, and then working to increase the carbon uptake from our natural and working lands. So this is just a sampling of the kinds of things that we're seeing. And what I really, again, want to emphasize, it's pretty similar across studies. Then you can ask, well, what's the scale of this? How do we think about how big a deal this is? And this is a figure from the US mid-century strategy, and Nate may go into this, I'm not sure, but just to note, this is showing the capacity additions over time in the future. And you can see that it's actually, it's quite a bit of capacity addition. So you're talking about over the next decade, annual capacity additions as big as at the point of the dash to gas in the early 2000s. So it's, it's a substantial level of investment and effort. So then you ask the question, well, how are we going to do this? How do we actually make this happen? There's a technological character to it, but there's also a societal character. How do you do this? How do you actually get this to happen through policies and actions? And I think one thing people really need to remember is that in the US is a federal system. And as Frank mentioned earlier, it's not just about what happens at the federal level, it's also about what happens at the state, cities, and so forth. Across all of society, universities, all of us are involved. And I've often found going outside of the US that there's a perception that in the two administrations ago, in the Obama administration, we must have been taking a great deal of action because Obama's administration was so excited about climate and so enthusiastic. In reality, there were a lot of challenges in moving forward because that wasn't shared across all of government. Over the last 4 years under President Trump, there's been an impression that perhaps we were not doing much on climate, but in fact, that's not necessarily true because over the last 4 years, there's really been, I would say, reinvigorated level of effort across states, cities, businesses, civil society, other parts of American society. And so if you look at all the actors that are committed to reaching the Paris goals in the US outside of the federal, you see it adds up to an enormous level or enormous coalition. So 70% of the US gross domestic product, about 2/3 of our US population, and 50% of all our emissions are covered by being within states, cities, or other elements of our society that have committed to supporting the Paris Agreement. So that's a huge coalition and critical to the success of success in meeting the NDC or any other time. So we can sort of think about 3 ways by which these actors are engaging to make progress. And there may be more, but let me just point out 3. One of them is that this notion of a dispersed approach across all of society allows for us to be innovating, trying new concepts, putting them in place, seeing what happens. And that's in fact how it's worked in the US. So non-federal actors have actually driven federal investment. There's 3 examples here, just to take the first. The GHG vehicle emission standards by California and 10 other states helped set the ambition for federal standards way back in 2009. And you're seeing that again and again. So one of the ways it's important that we think about this broader approach is this innovation and a chance to really push momentum. A second is simply to ensure that we get emissions reductions. And this is some work that we did a while back, and this is looking at the benefits of a bottom-up approach. And what this is showing on the vertical axis is emissions. And going forward is showing how we get down towards, in this case, 49%, so roughly 50% reductions. And what you can see is what's already baked in, that part that says 25%, about half of the way there is already baked in through federal policies and state, city, business, and so forth policies. But just by using bottom-up approaches alone without any federal action, we might cut the remaining amount in half and get us 3/4 of the way there. That's not to say that this can all be done by states, cities, and businesses. It needs to be everyone. but it's really important to see that a lot of the reduction can actually emerge from these bottom-up actors. And then one final point is just that it's not just that the city, states, business, this all of society approach leads to innovation. It's not just that we have this this robustness by everyone pushing in the same direction and sort of backstopping each other. Another benefit is basically city, states, businesses, the government, federal government, all need to work together. And this is from a report that we just put out from America's All In, and it's showing a sense of how to think about what the different roles would be for different actors in getting towards rapid electrification of the vehicle. So you can see the states might be adopting zero emissions vehicle standards, national, the same sort of thing. You can imagine businesses doing fleet purchases and so on and so forth. And I won't go through this all the way, but I just want to make the point that the key here is that there is not just a notion of backstopping, but all of these pieces working together. And I'm going to stop there because I think I'm a little over 10 minutes, but just to say, summarize, we have a real general sense of what 50 to 52% means. I think everybody understands it to some extent at a technical level. It's ambitious, but doable. And it's really going to depend on implementation. And to do that, we really need to be having every bullet in the holster. So this is a shared enterprise, not just of the federal government, but across all of society. And I think that's probably something that is transferable to many other countries, including potentially Australia. So thanks for that. And I'll hand it over to Nate and get an alternative perspective.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much, Leon. And of course, you see these are really just teasers, and we will have ample time in discussion to get back to any and all of the detail. If you're online, right, if you have questions, you can already put them in a chat or in the Q&A. What we will do later on is, if you want to take part actively in the discussion, we will turn you into panelists. Okay, so if you want to actually participate by speaking in the session, just let us know on the Q&A or on the chat, and for the discussion session, we'll turn you into panelists. Okay, thank you very much. All right, so our next speaker is Professor Nathan Hultman. He's currently Senior Advisor in the Office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate at the Department of State. He's also the founder and director of the Center for Global Sustainability at the University of Maryland and professor in the School of Public Policy there. His research focuses on assessing and developing national climate strategies, combining quantitative assessment and modeling with policy development and engagement. And he does that for the US as well as other major economies, including China, Brazil, India, Indonesia, and others. And I believe Nate is in Washington and quite regularly sees John Kerry Zoom across. Is that right?
Regularly is relative, but yes. Yeah. Good. Thanks. Let me get my window up here. Make sure I've got the right presentation. I think you should be able to see that. And there you go. So is that visible for everybody?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
All right, very good. Yeah, so thank you so much for the invitation and for that nice intro. And I have to say, so it turns out, so Leon and I do, I'm here at State Department for a period of time, up through COP26, but as you heard from the intro, Leon and I in my parallel life also work together, and I've worked on some of those projects that Leon is, I think, very helpfully sort of laid out to give us a context for U.S. climate action. And that was really a great springboard for me to dive deeper into the topic that I'm going to be talking more about, which is a recent effort we just did launch at the COP, which was our U.S. long-term strategy for 2021, which does open up the question of how do we get from today through the 2030 NDC through our 2035 net zero or 100% clean energy target all the way to our net zero goal. And I was happy to be able to work on this on the US side. I led this report, but there was a huge interagency team with a lot of talented people across DOE, EPA, and many other places that contributed to this. So Let me launch in, and hopefully we can get to our next slide. There we go. You can read President Biden's quote as you wish on the left. The few things I want to just highlight to kind of orient us. Leon gave us a kind of good context for where we are here. But one thing that is, I think, critical to note that a lot of the work that we've seen growing over the past 5 years or so is rooted, I think, very fundamentally in the Paris Agreement. And I think that that's tremendously positive. It really has underscored the efficacy of the mechanism of Paris, which is this pledge and review process that calls on countries to develop not only nationally determined contributions, which we've seen grow, I think, very rapidly in terms of what we understand is necessary to deliver a very good NDC from a country. And I think, Frank, you kind of mentioned this at the beginning, and as well as you were framing up. But also, the Paris Agreement calls on countries to develop and communicate about its long-term strategies. In one very important sense, these are quite linked. If we think about 2030 and 2050, I think Leon's presentation really effectively showed how those things are connected together. And I would sort of offer that under Paris, we in the United States and every other country is called on to regularly offer updates on its long-term strategies. These support very centrally the raising of global ambition as part of the Paris Agreement. So it's a very important piece of it. And the analytical community, represented, I think, very effectively, in part by a lot of people on the call today, have a really critical role to play as countries try to think through what the options, opportunities, and maybe even constraints are to getting to highly ambitious targets in all those timescales. So with that, I'm going to explain a little bit about a very complicated set of communications from the United States this year. Just so if people have heard about it, by the way, I'm not going to go, I just copied this from our report, but the two things on the left are really, I think, what are important to note. So first of all, the US is planning on, although has not yet released, a national climate strategy that will provide more detail on what we intend to do to get to the 2030 NDC. In addition to that, we have also already submitted our US long-term strategy. That's the one I'm going to be speaking about today, and from which you see all the figures from the report as I present. There is also another element of transparency reporting under the Framework Convention called the National Communication and Biennial Report. A number of countries are required to submit these, and we also did in advance of the COP. And then finally, there is an adaptation communication that the United States also delivered in advance of the COP. Now, numbers 1, 2, and 3 here are very centrally kind of similar, and our analytical strategy for this year actually had a core set of analyses that feed all 3 of these reports. So that's just an important and interesting kind of under the hood question as countries think about how to develop the capacity and capabilities to do these. We'd ended up just combining it, and I think that was sort of an efficient way to do it for us, mindful that the National Climate Strategy still hasn't been released. So I'm going to be speaking more about this, just the pathway to net zero. And one of the elements of the contributions of this report was actually to spell out with some more specificity what our 2050 net zero goal really is. We had a couple of comments that were made in specific, in our NDC, in a G7 communique, but we had never really fully spelled it out. And this report does finally spell out what we're doing. So it's on all major greenhouse gases. It includes both sources of emissions and removals. It doesn't include international aviation and international shipping. We don't anticipate using international market mechanisms. And then also we may update the report as appropriate. So those are all just sort of elements of good practice of doing these long-term strategies, just to be clear about it at a minimum. Obviously, it's better, for example, to include all greenhouse gases instead of just one, which we have done and we think is the right thing to do. Let me go to this next slide, which is echoing a couple of other US contributions, including our 2025 NDC and our 2030 NDC. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor there, but basically what What our 2050 goal does is, I think Leon actually very effectively kind of put on the table, essentially continues the decarbonization that we would see to get to our 2030 goal, and then stretches that out to continue to get to 2050. Now you'll notice that the slopes of these approximate straight line paths do change, with the more rapid pace being between now and 2030, and then the slightly less rapid pace being from 2030 to 2050. That doesn't necessarily, as many of you are aware, doesn't necessarily map to effort. It can be very difficult to squeeze out that last little bit from 2045 to 2050, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So one of the things that has come up before we were involved with the 2016 mid-century strategy, is that it's one thing to present a modeling pathway to get to net zero. It's another thing to actually articulate what the actual strategy is to get there. And I think that the US long-term strategy report gets us at least part of the way toward getting to the strategy piece. I do think we'll see more of that coming out with the national climate strategy, which is focusing more on near-term implementation than the LTS did. But ultimately, what I tried to do with this set of 4 things in the report was to articulate a version of what you heard from Leon's kind of all of society approach earlier, which is that first and foremost, of course, we're the US and we're focusing on federal government leadership. It's a time when there's very strong consensus across the government led by the White House about delivering on high ambition, as we heard in the introductory comment today. And that also includes potentially actions from Congress. And so we've had some actions already that are a sort of down payment on 550 plus billion on driving forward climate investments, climate friendly investments. We will see what happens, but certainly if the Build Back Better strategy passes out of Congress, we'll have a significantly larger amount of funding going in from the federal government. Second piece, and I'm not going to dwell on these too long because I think they're pretty familiar to all of you. Second piece, of course, is on R&D and innovation. And I'm just going to say, I think I'm just going to put that on the table, say we obviously cannot get to 2050 without pretty expansive investments in R&D and innovation. We have a number of technologies that are ready to go now, and we're deploying those as rapidly as possible. We'll do more with new policy and new investment, but we also have to continue to lay the foundation for technologies into the 2030s, 40s, and 50s. Non-federal government leadership here, Leon mentioned, for example, states, cities, municipalities, tribal groups. These are other governments and elected leaders who are driving forward on their own in ways that can be very complementary and helpful at helping deliver on overall US climate targets. And then finally, what I'll call all of society action, which would get us to include, for example, the universities, cultural institutions, and the private sector. And all of those are part of how the US is thinking about delivering on its overall climate targets. And I think that's an important and very dramatic change from how this was framed in previous cycles. So I know some of you are technical people, and I'm not going to dwell on this too long, but I want to just kind of flag what we did for this analysis. So first of all, we were focusing on laying out a number of different pathways to get to 2050 net zero. We used this common analytical core for all 3 of the reports, an interagency team with very very deep bench from EPA, DOE, and others, including some of our national labs like PNL, developed and ran the analysis. Obviously, there was leadership from the White House and State Department on framing the report and framing out the input assumptions, but a lot of the important work was done by that interagency team. We did have a few different models that we integrated to get these results, and this will be similar to what the National Climate Strategy is as well. So we used GCAM out of PNL. We used a version of NEMS run by the DOE Office of Policy. We also had some supplemental models that helped us with land sector questions, for example, GTM, the forest and agriculture sector optimization model. We had a kind of integrated set of modeling related processes from USDA, and we used the EPA non-CO2 MAC curves to help us with our non-CO2s. We also used the growing literature, I think Leon also alluded to this, on national planning, NDCs, target setting, and pathways to net zero. I think it's really important for us in the government to contextualize and anchor our work in a set of broader good practice. And we made that as a goal for this year to at least be conversant with the good work that's already been out there, and when possible, citing it and drawing from it in our actual work. And then finally, we added an assessment of benefits and economic outcomes in the long-term strategy report. Because it was 2050, we had to draw primarily from a lit review. I think there's room for expanded action there, but I think that's an important new area that we could work on. I'm going to just not go through this in great depth, but I want to show all of this is in the actual report, so you should by all means feel invited to take a deeper dive into the report. But just to show you the way we kind of did some of this work is to, as we often do, to look at some different scenarios. And the way we did this for the LTS was that we actually tried to look at a kind of an all of the above kind of good outcomes scenario, which we called our balanced advanced scenario. And then we actually ranged down across a number of different ones, different sectors. For example, we ranged down in non-CO2s in one scenario. We ranged down on buildings in another scenario, just to kind of see where that would leave us in terms of different pathways to get to net zero. And that was one of the core goals of this particular report. Overall, the patterns echo, as Leon very helpfully noted, echoed kind of, there's often kind of a just general set of activities that we know we have to do. So we know we have to decarbonize electricity, and then we have to electrify as much as possible. We know we need to cut energy waste or improve efficiency, as the case may be, focus on methane and other non-CO2s, and then in our case, scaling up CO2 removal. Those of you who have worked in this space before, you can sort of slice and dice those categories a little bit differently, but overall, they basically tell a similar story. The real interesting question comes in as we would sort of importantly note, what are the kind of driving assumptions, or sometimes the policy drivers that kind of lead to those outcomes, and where do you get the most bang for the buck in terms of near-term and long-term reductions? So the sort of core or central result from the long-term strategy is sort of shown by this waterfall figure, which echoes the figure from the 2016 version. What you can see is we chose what we called a representative pathway to get to 2050 net zero. We deliberately fuzzed up the boundaries between those because they were designed to be kind of a rough kind of overall what the US would likely see happen to get to our 2050 net zero. And then on the right of this figure, what you can see is the actual results from the modeling for each of the different scenarios. Mindful that each of those has a significant amount of ranging. If you look at the box that's kind of, it says scenario range, which is a white box with some arrows in it, that's a rough indicator of where the different sort of boundaries sort of happen between, for example, the energy efficiency block, which is that kind of orangey warm colors, to the decarbonizing electricity block, which is reducing fossil fuels with or increasing fossil fuels with CCS and going to zero carbon generation, going to the energy transitions, which is sort of our fuel switching, more or less, to non-CO2s, land sink, and CO2 removal technologies. So overall, again, those categories generally are roughly kind of in the zone that you see in the representative pathway. But given the ranging, you can see that there might be alternate pathways that would depend on fundamentally really two big things. One big thing is, what are the policies and how do those evolve, particularly over the next decade, something we don't have full clarity and resolution on today. And the second thing, of course, is how do technology costs change, particularly in the out years. And I guess there's a third big thing, which is how does our land sector sink evolve? And we also dealt with that by just giving it some ranging. Okay, I'm almost done here. I just want to give you a couple of quick highlights. Here's just one kind of result that we got for just energy emissions and gigatons of CO2. And this just gives you a sense, in a slightly different visual form of how the model results look if you kind of plot them all on the same figure. And again, what you see is generally thematically kind of, we have transportation energy emissions declining pretty dramatically. We have electricity sector emissions decline even more dramatically in the near term to get us to net zero. I won't go through all of it, but you can see at least an indication of the ranging. And what that ranging really tells us is that all of these scenarios, by the way, get us to net zero in 2050. It just means that if we don't do as well in transportation, we have to do better in other places. And that's kind of one of the interesting dimensions of this work. I'm going to actually just go quickly through the electricity generation. Here you can see the major story, of course, is renewables growth, but you see a little bit of other interesting things happening. Fossil with CCS growing, maybe a little bit of hedging up on nuclear toward the end of the mid-century. This figure, fortunately, Leon already covered, so I'm actually not going to need to even do that. But I want to note one of the things that you can see in this figure, now that I've oriented you a little bit on our scenario analysis, is in the right-hand side. You can actually now understand what all those different figures really mean, all those different columns really mean. All they're doing is just presenting you those different ranging scenarios. One other final thing before I conclude. It was mentioned at the very beginning, one of the key outcomes of the COP, I think, was on methane. We have a new global methane pledge. And also, I think it's important, as was also noted, that China has agreed to work with the US on also developing a methane action plan. I was involved in both of those activities and am very excited about the possibility for methane and also for the Chinese work on methane as well. I would note that in the long-term strategy, there's something interesting here, which is that the reductions in methane, N2O, and F gases don't actually do as much as we think they might actually do. This is a really interesting area of new analysis, and I think that there's a lot of interest in EPA, for example, at updating the MAC curves. There's some reason to believe that the MAC curves might be underestimating the out years in terms of what we might actually get. We might be more innovative, we might be able to invent new things. Those aren't really in the analysis yet because we didn't have the fact base for it, but I think it'd be really exciting to be working on those topics over coming years and get a little bit better clarity on what the non-CO2s might end up doing. So just to conclude, I'm not going to actually spend a lot of time on this, just to say I think that these long-term strategies are a critical part of Paris. I actually can foresee a time, this is just a personal comment, when we actually integrate the long-term strategies in the NDC reporting, and it's something that the analytical community can be deeply helpful on and is critically important for our governments, as well as for people outside of the government to better understand how well we're doing, how ambitious are we being, how much degree of feasible potential is every country really stepping up to realize. So with that, I'm just going to conclude saying welcoming further discussion on our assessments and any other topics people want to raise. Thank you.
Nate, thanks very much indeed. And I think your explanation here of the importance of a detailed and analytically well-founded long-term strategy are really very important indeed. Looking forward to the discussion later on. Our next speaker is Rachael de Hosson. She's with the Australian federal government, as indeed quite a number of our participants here in the room and online are today. Rachael is with the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. She is Chief of Staff to the Special Advisor on Low Emissions Technology. That's Dr. Alan Finkel, the former Chief Scientist. And in this role, she supports both brokering international partnerships on low emissions technology, of which there are a few for Australia now, as well as overseeing the implementation of the Australian government's low emissions technology roadmap. So a very large job indeed, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Frank. I'll just check everyone can hear me. I'm actually not sure where my mic is, but as long as we're getting picked up, that's great. Thank you, Frank, for bringing us together today. It's been fantastic to hear from some of our US colleagues, and indeed to hear that we are facing very similar challenges in terms of the decarbonisation task ahead of us. What I would like to focus on today is the Australian government's technology investment roadmap, which is one of the policies that underpins the net zero plan. So rather than the plan in general, I'll be focusing very much on one piece of the puzzle. And so just quickly to open with, I'm sure everyone is aware that the government announced a plan for net zero by 2050 in October this year. Much like the US, it's a whole of economy plan to achieve net zero emissions and includes all major greenhouse gases. And the government set out 5 principles to guide the plan, which you can see there: technology, not taxes, really looking at voluntary uptake of technologies, driving down the costs of those technologies, keeping energy prices down, and being affordable, being accountable for progress. So at the very core of the plan is this idea that we need to drive down the technology costs to accelerate their deployment across not only in Australia, but globally. And this approach builds on and is underpinned by our technology investment roadmap, which was a process that began in 2000 and is an enduring adaptive process that sets priorities and stretch goals for the Australian government investment in low emissions technologies. And really the core aim is really about getting the cost of those technologies down towards parity with their higher emitting alternatives, rapidly increasing uptake and achieving those significant emissions reductions. And so in the government's net zero plan, the modelling conducted for that plan shows that the technologies that we're pursuing under the roadmap, and if we reach the goals that we have for those technologies, which I'll go into very, very shortly, will reduce emissions by 40%. So it is a really key part of the government's plan. And so a little bit more about the roadmap. The overarching vision set out in the roadmap is for a prosperous Australia recognised as a global low emissions technology leader. And so this really is about recognising that along with the associated emissions reductions, there are real economic opportunities for Australia in the increased deployment of low emissions technologies. But we do need to meet a number of challenges and also opportunities in order to achieve that overarching vision. And that is the first of delivering those low-cost, low-emissions technologies, in particular to deliver more affordable, clean and reliable energy for transportation, heating, production and power, expanding production and increasing productivity while substantially reducing emissions from Australia's primary industries, preserving and expanding our onshore manufacturing and energy-intensive products, and capturing new export markets for low-emissions commodities. And then scaling the geological and biological sequestration to provide globally significant permanent sequestration of CO2. So how does the roadmap process go about meeting these big technology challenges? Practically, it's a set of annual low emissions technology statements. But these statements are integral for the government's strategy. They identify where the government will drive its investment. They articulate some of the deployment pathways for the technologies that they're prioritising. They articulate associated government actions and investments. And importantly, they'll provide us with an important check-in and review point annually. The very first statement released in September last year set out this process for prioritising technologies, which is rigorous and based on 4 prioritisation filters. And so these filters look across not only abatement potential, and when we think about abatement potential, it's not only the potential of a particular technology to contribute to abatement here in Australia, but also the potential to contribute to emissions reductions internationally through, for example, exports of hydrogen or low emissions materials such as steel. We look at economic benefit. So which technologies have potential high economic benefit for Australia, both in terms of investment, but also in terms of jobs. We look at where Australia has a comparative advantage. So where do we have those natural endowments, expertise, skills, or other resources which can make us competitive in a particular technology? And then finally, where government investment can make a difference, both in reducing costs, increasing technology readiness, and encouraging deployment. And so the initial process was running a range of technologies through these filters to really look at where the Australian government should focus its effort. And that process is supported by a Technology Investment Advisory Council, which has members across business, industry, from the in Australia, and is led by Dr. Alan Finkel, who's also our special advisor on low emissions technology. And so where we've landed is under these 4 filters, the government's identified 6 priority technologies. Each of these technologies has a stretch goal, which put plainly is a cost target that, if achieved, should make these technologies competitive with their higher emitting alternatives. And these are the goals that the government is really driving towards and will track progress against. And so the technologies: clean hydrogen. It's no secret in this room that Australia is extremely ambitious in terms of becoming a hydrogen leader, with a goal of production of clean hydrogen of under $2 per kilogram. Energy storage is also there, an incredibly important element of decarbonising our electricity sector. And so the goal there is for electricity storage for firming of under $100 per megawatt hour. And as we think more and more about energy storage, the focus was initially on some of that shorter duration. And I think our focus is more and more now looking at what we'll need for those longer durations to increase penetration of renewables into our grid. Third is low emissions materials, with a focus on steel and aluminium, with, again, those cost targets looking at production of those of steel and aluminium. Whilst our stretch goals look at the production of those products, we are again increasingly looking at the supply chains for those products as well, including alumina refining and opportunities for Australia in iron ore and beneficiation of iron ore. Carbon capture and storage is next, with a target of getting to $20 per tonne of CO2 for compression, hub transport and storage. And of course, carbon capture and storage will be important for some of our harder to abate sectors, and note in some of the presentations we've seen this morning, also very important for the US. And finally, soil carbon, where we have a target on the measurement technologies of under $3 per hectare per year. And I've left ultra-low cost solar as the last one because it is our newest priority that was added this year in the 2021 low emissions technology statement, with the goal of achieving solar electricity generation at $15 per megawatt hour, which is around 1/3 of the current costs that we see in Australia. And so why prioritise this technology this year? Well, also as part of the work that we've done under the roadmap this year, we've looked at the deployment pathways for the 5 initial priority technologies and where those cost reductions might come from in order to meet those goals that we have. And that work just shows that clean, cheap electricity will be fundamental to a range of the technologies, particularly hydrogen from renewable electrolysis, but also for low emissions materials, including aluminium. But just more broadly, the need for cheap, clean electricity to underpin that transition of our electricity sector is really fundamental, and something that, again, we've seen a big focus for the US. And so ultra low cost solar, a big new priority for the government this year. The other bit of work that we've done this year is looked at when we might be able to see these stretch goals being met. So we've looked at the deployment pathways, where those costs might come down, and then started to think about, well, what's the earliest we might see these under a really a scenario of high technology uptake. And you'll see here that we've provided some ranges for each of those technologies. The earliest there is where we think that we could see the technologies reach those stretch goals, with a range of increasing confidence beyond that. I won't go into each of them right now, but happy to discuss later with those questions. The other category of technology that's been introduced this year is one called enabling infrastructure. And this category recognises that investments will be needed in key infrastructure to help deploy priority technologies, but also just other low emissions technologies across our economy. And so 2 priorities for this year. The first is battery charging and hydrogen refuelling stations. And this is key to uptake of zero emissions vehicles, and really starting to focus on what's required in the transport sector. And the second is the digital grid, which is the digital operating system, essential for our wonderful friends at AEMO, who we'll hear from next, to manage ever-increasing uptake of renewable generation in the grid. And so the commitment made by the Australian government is to support those technologies and invest in those. And so in sum, we now have a portfolio of technologies that can help to drive emissions reductions across the economy in a range of sectors. I guess the question is, though, then why does prioritisation matter and what impact does it have? And this is where we get to the crux of the investment roadmap, which is it is a roadmap for investment. And so setting these priorities is a commitment from government that these are the ones which it will drive investment and actions towards. It's really intended to give confidence and direction to industry, the research sector, but also signal Australia's focus internationally and where we think that we can contribute. And so the government has committed to at least $21 billion of investment out to 2030. And this is being delivered through a range of programs. There's bespoke programs, some of them are listed here, and you can see they map to our priority technologies in terms of clean hydrogen, carbon capture, use and storage, and future fuels, which is really about that refuelling infrastructure. Also work on international partnerships, which is looking internationally at who we can work with to really drive down the costs of some of those priority technologies. And we've agreed a number this year, which again, I'd be happy to talk about more if there's questions on that. But there's also ongoing funding through two key agencies, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, who have demonstrated great success in terms of renewable energy in Australia. And the Australian government is now broadening their mandates to really focus them on these priority technologies, both along from the spectrum of investing in the research and development right through to pre-commercialisation, which is where the Clean Energy Finance Corporation really plays. And then aside from these programs, we are seeing the government invest and commit to those complementary policies to support the priority technologies, including, for example, a voluntary zero emissions gas scheme to really increase early demand for things like clean hydrogen, but also development of guarantee of origin certification scheme for hydrogen, which is about helping to enable those markets and that transparency. And then finally, I did want to mention how we will know whether this is working or not. And this goes to some of the comments that have been made in terms of updating on our plans. Is that we've also set out an impact evaluation framework, which will look at annually and track how the government is progressing towards some of these cost targets. We'll look at a number of metrics, including government investment, but also co-investment, whether those enabling policies are being delivered, and then we'll start to track those costs as well. And so this will be an important feedback loop to look at whether our policies are working, whether there's more needs to be done on any particular technology. I think it's also worth mentioning at this point that the stretch goals and targets from the roadmap have also been integrated into Australia's NDC. And so will be updated and reported on through those mechanisms as well. And so I think I've well taken my 10 minutes, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Rachael, for explaining about the stretch goals, some truly ambitious targets for some selected technologies there. And of course, the reduction in clean energy technology costs is what has fundamentally driven the very tremendous change that we're already seeing in electricity generation. That's the topic of our next talk. So welcome, Nicola Falcon. Nicola is with the Australian Energy Market Operator. So that's Leon and Nate, that's the Australian Grid Operator, in fact, and also to an extent the Australian Grid Planner, if we may say that. And Nicola also heads AEMO's forecasting division. She's also responsible for delivering integrated system modelling and cost-benefit analysis for AEMO's integrated system plan, which is the annual assessment of future generating and grid integration issues. as well as reliability assessments to provide decision support for AEMO's planning and operations team, as well as industry. Now, AEMO's new integrated system plan is just out and has been in the news for some much more rapid scenarios for coal closure than previously. That's been notable. And over to you, Nicola.
Thanks, Frank. Can you see the slides okay?
Thank you.
Great. I know we're running out of time and I do want to be able to allow for a pretty good discussion. So I'm going to flick through these pretty quickly, partly because, as you've just said, we published the integrated system plan, the draft for 2022, on Friday. So there's a lot more information in the public arena for you to follow up on, and some of you are probably quite familiar with it already. But what I wanted to just flag for all of the audience is that, you know, we look at the integrated system plan as a whole of system plan for the energy sector in the NEM, the National Electricity Market. And that requires us to look not only at grid scale developments and renewable technologies and storage, to Rachel's point she's just been talking about, but also thinking about how consumers might participate and engage in that electricity system in a different way in the future, and what, if any, transmission would be key enabler for that. So really is an end-to-end whole of system plan. Like Nate, we've looked at a number of scenarios to achieve various rates of decarbonisation, not only in the NEM, but economy-wide. And we came up with 4 scenarios that are aptly named just to really talk about the pace of change, from slow change, progressive change, step change, right through to a hydrogen superpower scenario, which also has the 1.5 degree alignment with Paris. And we've engaged consultants to help us convert that into a NEM equivalent type carbon budget, which you can see on the slide in the right here varies depending on which scenario we're in. But interestingly, we engaged in what we call a Delphi process to try and get a sense from participants as to which scenario is the most likely scenario going forward. And step change scenario, which is sort of this purple one in the middle, was considered the most likely, that has quite aggressive reductions in emissions in the NEM over the next decade, which I'll talk about a little bit more very, very briefly. And a lot of the reason for that is, obviously, we know we've got a net zero 2050 commitment from government, but to Leon's point right at the beginning, there's a lot of other sort of non-federal actors, if you like, that are driving the momentum at the moment. We've had record rates of renewable generation development, and that's expected to continue, and certainly is outpacing policy at the moment. What we are seeing, if we focus now on the step change scenario, if that's considered the most likely, we're seeing that we have had record rates of renewable development in the NEM, but those rates have got to continue and ramp up even in the next decade to achieve, and I should say, the Paris Agreement of no more than 2 degrees is the one that step change is modelled on. We have got about 15 gigawatts in our system today. We would need to triple that by 2030, double that again by 2040, and double that again by 2050 in order to meet the step change scenario. And a lot of that is driven by rapid closure of coal. And you can see in the chart on the right that compared to what is currently the expected coal closure dates, which is the red line on this chart, we're seeing that a much more aggressive and accelerated coal closure will be required to meet the carbon budget that's assumed within a step change world. But also, again, to Nate's point earlier, we're seeing electrification. So once we decarbonise the NEM, that's going to provide opportunities for other sectors to electrify and as a means for their own decarbonisation of sectors. And in this scenario, we can see that that could result in a doubling of consumption in the NEM by 2050. So we're left with that double whammy, if you like, that we've got to try and invest to replace the coal as it's retiring quickly and more rapidly reach a low emission NEM. And at the same time, we then have to continue that investment and accelerate it in order to be able to meet the increased consumption from other sectors being electrified. To do that, we see that storage is going to be really important, and Rachael's already touched on the importance in the technology roadmap of longer duration storage. In the near term, in the next decade, we're seeing that, once we've got Snowy 2.0 and we've got significant depths of storage in that, what we're really going to need is medium storage of between 4 and 12 hours depths to be able to help balance the renewable generation. So very, very consistent with what Rachael was just talking to you about. And we're also going to need to continue to see a role and a crucial role for gas to deal with some of those extreme weather events that we touched on right at the very, very beginning of the discussion with climate change, or even simple dark, still periods where we might have the wind available, or the demand is very, very high due to an extreme temperature. It's not looking economically efficient to build a lot of storage to meet those sorts of periods, and that's where gas will play a crucial role. Now, we've looked at this from a lens of, is transmission necessary to enable some of these new technologies? And we certainly have seen that transmission is a enabler of a low cost transition to this sort of future NEM. But we can do it in other ways. We can accelerate closure of coal even further to meet a carbon budget so that we can continue to use gas for longer, probably coupled with carbon capture and storage. Offshore wind is another technology that we see that we could use if we can't build a lot of transmission on the mainland. But at current cost, that's looking like a more expensive technology. But it does sort of reinforce the importance of a technology roadmap and focusing on how we can actually bring technology costs down in the future, because some of these technologies could actually help deliver an efficient outcome in future times. But really, at the moment, transmission does seem to be the most efficient way to deliver this transition. It's not our role to look at what prices are to consumers. That is something that I think will change as we continue to get a better handle on how rapidly we can bring down costs and low solar and low batteries and so forth, as Rachael was talking about. But at the moment, with current projections of cost reductions on various technologies, we see that transmission is still going to remain a key enabler to maximise the diversity of renewable generation across the system. And that would deliver 29 billion of net market benefits for consumers. And, that's really the crux of it for us. Is transmission is going to, even in a future world where you've got a lot of renewable generation in EV state, it's going to maximise that geographic diversity when the sun is not available and you rely more on wind. We can actually see quite a lot of geographic diversity by tapping into resources from Tasmania all the way through to Queensland. But I just want to leave you with a couple of really key assumptions that all of this makes. The modeling's easy, relatively speaking. We can look at what technologies we have available to us today and how we might be able to deploy them to deliver on a net zero by 2050 and sooner. Some of the things that are really key assumptions to this plan that do need a lot more thought about is how are we going to actually engineer a system with 100% instantaneous renewable generation for significant periods of time if we transition to this sort of future technology. What market reform incentives are going to be needed to really incentivise the investment? There'll be times we see that it's not worth building more transmission, it's not worth building more storage. It's going to be the most economically efficient thing to do to curtail renewable generation, particularly solar during summer periods where we've sort of built and sized it to meet winter, but then you're going to have surplus energy in the summer and potential curtailment. So how do we actually make sure we've got markets that incentivise that investment in those cases? What are the supply chain opportunities and how are we going to realise them? We just saw in Leon's presentation at the beginning the amount of capacity build per year that's going to be required in the US. We're going to be competing for those skills, that equipment, that finance to also get our skates on to develop the sort of renewable investment we need in Australia. So how do we actually expand the capability of the supply chain and make sure that those opportunities are realised for Australia? We as an industry have social license to build that infrastructure. That's an assumption, but it's something that's going to need a lot of work and a lot of community engagement, because even with what we're talking about in a land that's, we're blessed with a large carbon footprint or a large land footprint, but we're still going to need to build a lot of transmission and a lot of generation in order to meet this plan. So how are we working with our communities to get that social license? And then the last one is we're assuming that we do embrace digital technologies to be able to make sure that we can tap into and coordinate the distributed energy resources behind the meter with what we need large scale to actually make the system, the two work together and make sure that the distributed resources can actually still help support the system and meet the system services required. So I'll stop at that point and see if we can leave time for a discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Nicola, for that overview. And I'm sure we'll come back on to details in questions. Now, depending how we go with the discussion, we may take the prerogative to steal a few minutes from the break. Let it run a few minutes past 10, but we won't have a huge time overrun. So the way we're going to handle this, if you're online, right, please let us know if you want to be put on the screen as panelists. A few of you will find yourselves put up as panelists, whether you like it or not. It's going to happen. You can always keep the camera off if you prefer. You can also use the Q&A and the chat. And obviously in the room, right, the conventional method, like it's 2019 pretty much. Now, we'll get going with the discussion. And just a few observations of some of the things we've heard. So first of all, the need for detailed, high quality analysis to inform a comprehensive strategy. And that difference, Nate told us about that difference between modeling and an actual strategy for either 2030 or 2050. Secondly, the important role of subnational actors and of non-government actors. Thirdly, policy, of course, deployment versus technology development, or maybe both. And then, of course, right through the discussion, we have this emphasis on the different sectors and what they can do, and electricity, obviously, at the core, electrification of transport, electrification of industry, various other solutions in industry as well. The land sector got a fair bit of mention, and also, of course, and I'd love to come back to that in Q&A if we can, carbon dioxide removal. So we saw in the US scenarios that took quite a significant role. I think I saw about 0.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide removal per year in the US in those scenarios that you put up per year by 2050. So quite important. If I can just kick proceedings off while we check through the questions online here. With a question about uncertainty versus what we're quite confident about, right? And so the US long-term strategy, the analysis there, you showed us confidence intervals around things. And so if maybe I can ask all of our speakers, if you want to comment, what are the kinds of things that you feel really confident about in terms of a decarbonisation analysis? And what are some of the things that we're genuinely not quite sure about yet? Nate, do you want to go first, Leon?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question, and a really important one for doing this kind of target setting process and the political discussions that have to be undertaken to settle on goals. We have to know kind of how confident we are in maybe reaching that goal. So that's a critical piece. From the work that we've done, and I'm just sort of speaking mostly on the long-term strategy, but really this is a body of work that is similar to what Leon presented and shares in some ways a lot of common core modeling and toolkit. The near term, like renewable electricity costs, that kind of stuff, I think that's pretty much like in good shape, right? We still have to deploy all the technologies, so I don't want to say like it's done, we can go home, but in terms of knowing the like boundedness of that problem is pretty decent, right? The things that are harder to predict on our side, like are for getting to 2050 net zero, for example, is the CO2 removal technologies later in the couple decades. Industrial decarbonization, how we're going to do that, that's actually much kind of, well, it's complex. I think some people work on that in this room and would know it's industry is not one thing, it's many different processes. And each of those processes needs some kind of substitution. Sometimes there aren't good substitutions for it. And so industry is another big chunk that's uncertain how we're going to get there. I'd put the non-CO2s on the table as in the longer run. I think we know less about how to do that. And then in our case in the US, the land sector sink is kind of more like a wild card. It's like a little bit hard to predict how we're going to deal with that. So anyway, that's kind of from my view, but I'm sure all the others would have views on this as well.
I can step in, staying on the US side. I mean, I would agree with Nate. I think there's a difference in certainty up through 2030 and after 2030. And after 2030, there's uncertainty about all Nate said, including things like direct air capture, of course, hydrogen, bioenergy. There's ammonia. There's a whole range of technological uncertainties that will have to be played out, particularly as we think about the hard to decarbonize sectors. I guess just to add color to it, I think I agree with Nate, which is not surprising, that the near term is not particularly uncertain in some sense of what we need to do. It's pretty straightforward, but I do think the uncertainties are all going to come out in the societal and political economy aspects of this. I think maybe to put it a different way, there's risks that are going to be run. So there's questions about whether we can actually get the policies in place to do it. But let's say we do. I think there's a lot that needs to be thought through about the risks that are run from not doing the ways that actually are felt to be robust by the people who are dealing with that. So for example, does your electric heat pump work as well as your gas-fired furnace? Can you actually charge your electric car? And then of course, the one we all pay attention to, and Australia obviously pays an enormous amount of attention to, is are we going to have trouble with all these renewables on the grid? And so I think to me, it's a lot of this, how do you manage the speed of something that can be done, certainly can be done, but how do you manage doing it without a lot of disruption over a very short period of time for the 2030? To me, that's really where the issue comes in for the 2030 timeframe. After 2030, it's like, we don't know how good is, hopefully hydrogen is as great as the Australian plan has it, and so on and so forth. But before then, I think it's really those sorts of issues of implementation and speed and hopefully no backlash.
Rachael, Nicola, did you want to provide your take?
And I think there's a lot of similarities there in what we can be confident on. I mean, Nicola, you can talk to the electricity sector, but again, sorry, I need
that's all
to
right.
make
No,
sure
no,
I've
don't
got
worry. Just keep going.
a camera on. I think there's big questions about the scale and the pace and how quickly all of this can happen. For us, there's big questions around hydrogen. To be frank, the government is betting on hydrogen as a solution across a range of sectors. The industrial sector and that industrial decarbonisation, just echo the comments that there's thousands of sources of emissions which are all different across the industrial sector in Australia, and so that's a real challenge. Agriculture is, of course, as well is a real challenge, and will we see some of those early technologies for livestock become solutions, and the negative emissions technologies. And then I would absolutely echo the comments on how we ensure that there is social acceptance, that we can move this as quickly as we can, and that we do get the range of actors which we'll need to see calling to deploy these technologies working together. So for Australia, that is federal government, state governments, it's local governments, but it's industry too. And so that conversation and that coordination and collaboration.
And Nicola, if I can just say, you mentioned in your presentation that your Delphi survey of stakeholders showed one of your more rapid change scenarios, perhaps the most rapid change scenarios, is considered the most likely. So what does that tell us?
Well, it probably tells us a lot of things in terms of people's eagerness to sort of keep moving on this as rapidly as possible. But I think from an uncertainty perspective, and I should say the step change is not the most aggressive, the hydrogen superpower one is, and it has all of coal gone in the next sort of 10 years. I think for us, we generally don't yet have the operational toolkit to manage instantaneous renewable generation on the system, and that's coming in, we're not talking decades, we're talking 3 or 4 years. So for us, they're the things that we really need to focus on so that we can get out of the way. If everyone thinks this is coming that quickly, we need to really, really ramp up our ability to be able to manage that system. So I think that's the thing. And then from a hydrogen perspective, is it going to be all grid connected electrolyzers or not? I mean, we could be finding not only a doubling of the NEM, it could be a 5- or 6-fold increase in the NEM. That's got huge implications in terms of what we need to also start doing from an infrastructure perspective. So lots of future uncertainties that might have near-term impacts.
Well, thank you very much. And the floor is open, both here in the room and online. So simply jump in. Anyone really?
Ross Gawler from Monash University speaking. I think one of the issues we haven't talked today is the fact that all these grand plans could be quite quickly undermined by the kind of political movement that we saw took over in the US with the previous presidency. And I think we have the same threats, the same potential threats in Australia. And I think that in all of the thinking that we're doing about the technology and the economics is really, really important. But I think what I have seen very little of is how are we focusing on the losers, because it's the losers who have been dominating the political process in the last 10 years in Australia, the potential losers, I mean, like the coal industry employees, for example, who have significant or have enough political power to block real action on climate change. And I'd be interested to hear from the people in the US about how they feel we should be managing and how we should be communicating with those people who are going to miss out, at least in the medium term, through this transition.
Yeah, so this is, I think, a critical point, and I'm going to also pull in one of the questions in the chat as well. One thing we've seen is a development between 5 or 6 years ago and today is that there is a much stronger emphasis on thinking about embedding climate policy in a broader kind of economic agenda. And we actually heard this in the introductory framing comment of today's session. And I think that that's a pretty important element of how to think about framing climate policy up and embedding it in this kind of broader comment about just transitions and equity and broader prosperity. So I think it's very good. I don't think that I have all the answers or we have all the answers on how to do that best. I think there's some good attempts being made right now through Congress to kind of think through that and through the administration to think through that, to support that in a lot of diverse ways. But that's kind of a clear mandate, I think, to kind of not just sort of think about it as just sort of a technology play, but think of this as really something that is all of society. And that actually ties to the second piece there too, which is embedding this more in not just a federal government set of policies, critical as they are to success, but also making sure that those other societal conversations are happening to support them in whatever ways we can from the federal side, but also to encourage that those discussions to be happening at the state and the city and investors level and all that. So a couple of different approaches. Again, I'm not saying, by the way, that we can just rest easy and be done having said that, but I think that that's certainly a difference I've seen in terms of how, on the US side, how we're kind of at least thinking about the enormity of the challenge to kind of address it on these multiple fronts.
And it's from an Australian end, it's probably easier for me to respond than others. It's widely recognized, right, that the social transition, the looming economic transition in particular in some regions of the country, and therefore some electorates, is a major difficulty, not just in the actual transition, but also in the engagement with the transition that is coming our way. And so I think it's actually very important in any kind of bilateral or multilateral dialogue to exchange notes about how those difficult conversations can actually be had in a meaningful way and in a non-polarizing way. I think that's really the Australian Association of Learned Academies recently produced a report, the Australian Energy Transition Research Plan, which put very heavy emphasis on question of social license and community well-being and prospects for regions in that transition as the key enabling factor. And the economics and the tech follows on from that in that view. I'm sure we have many other questions. The floor is open. I'm looking
Frank.
Bruce.
Yes, hi, and thank you very much. I found this an excellent session.
Two Bruces. Bruce Martin, please go right ahead. Victoria University.
Okay, hi, and it's a great time. Very, very keen to hear the views of the panel on some key changes. It seems that we're in a very difficult position now where we've entered the realm of grand plans to make enormous changes quickly. And that brings into focus the question as to who ought to be bearing the risk as between consumers, investors, and the taxpayer. It seems in the energy sector, the underlying presumption is that the energy consumer and the taxpayer ought to be bearing that risk. But I'm quite worried about that. It's easy to come up with a grand plan, but on just about every element of the change, it's uncertain. So I'd be really keen to get the panelists' views on how this massive change across the economy can be accomplished with sensible allocation of risks. Thank you.
Any other panelists happy to respond?
Look, I'll throw in from the energy one because it's probably front of mind and quite an obvious one, but I'd be keen to hear the US's views as well. We are very aware of the risk. We're trying to look at it from a perspective of what's least regretful. When you think of risks of over and underinvestment, acknowledging the number of technologies that could emerge in the future. Great to have grand plans that you're sort of looking to the future when you're thinking about the investments you need now, but I think you need to have adaptable and flexible plans to actually minimise that risk. Who should bear it? For us, it's actually relatively easy because if it's beneficial to consumers in the market, then they bear it. If there are benefits that are broader than market benefits, then that's left for third parties, whether it be governments or other third parties, to bear that part of the risk if they want to invest.
Okay. All right. Bruce Johns.
Yep, I've got probably a question for anybody who'd like to answer, but I guess Nate and Leon in particular, I guess Nate, considering where he is, we're very interested in Australia, I guess, on the trade side, the potential of trade. And we heard a scenario, one of the modelling scenarios was Australia as a hydrogen superpower, which I think is definitely on probably a bipartisan issue within Australian government now. But if you look at, I guess, the international environment, it seems to be a bit Wild West at the moment. We've got, big developments with Europeans with their CBAM policy, and there's been some announcements in the US, particularly in relation to steel and aluminium trade, with this global arrangement between the EU and the US, sort of putting in place a potential, I guess, carbon club. I'm just sort of interested in your viewpoints about where it's all going and how coherent is it, and particularly thinking about the CBAM policy and that global arrangement. They seem to be almost in different sort of universes in terms of how their perhaps the policy design might look. So I guess, over to you on that. Where do you see that going internationally?
I'm going to do my best, but I don't have the answer to that. I do think that it is not figured out at all. And I will also note that coming from the US, it is definitely not figured out, given that the US's engagement in issues associated with climate and trade is something that we did not engage in aggressively over the last 4 years. But yeah, I was actually just on another call or another meeting this morning that was specifically on the US steel and US EU steel deal. I think you're seeing, actually my colleagues in the embassy would actually be the best person to comment on this. But what you're seeing is now, there's been an interest in trade as, for geopolitical reasons already and for domestic employment and competitiveness reasons. And I think now, for the first serious time recently, you're now seeing them trying to engage climate in it. And I do think it's just the wild, wild west. I also note, if you look, there's also the questions about Article 6, which is not exactly the same, but is related. And I don't recall where we ended up after the COP, but that's also proven to be a really serious challenge for how we're going to think about trade, even if it's done, in these sort of broader dimensions and Article 6. But anyways, so that's all I can really say is I don't think it's been figured out. I think even on the conversation I was hearing today with a bunch of Europeans, they don't understand how it's all gonna fit together. But I guess I would turn it to my US colleagues who may be more engaged in thinking about the trade dimensions of this.
Sure, thank you. I think, Leanne, you got mostly right. What we can say from the U.S. Embassy perspective is that we are, starting with the trade policy agenda and that prioritization of putting the planet on a sustainable climatic trajectory. We are seeing that turn into sort of the day-to-day business of how the instructions that come from Washington to us here in the way that we support investments or trade around energy. So it is a conversation that's continuing to go on. And I want to tie that back with the earlier question about risk, where, in our conversations with insurers, with investors, with companies, we are seeing decisions made based on perceived and real risk associated with either the production of carbon, emission carbon, or the potential to do so. So those market forces, along with the policy forces, are coming together in, as Leon said, a very preliminary way now, but we do see that it is moving in that direction. Hope that's helpful.
All right. We will soon draw to a close, but just to see, Rachael, whether you wanted to.
No, I think on the last question, I mean, we are now looking at needing to develop essentially new markets, new international markets for products, and looking at how we will trace those emissions. And big focus, I think, for the Australian government, just in relation to hydrogen, is that certification scheme, and looking at emissions from for those products. How do you trace that? How do you give these people who are buying those products confidence? It's a very small part of it, right? But it is one that I think will be integral to start thinking more broadly about how do we underpin those broader, sustainable international markets. But I think we are just very much at the beginning of some really hard conversations internationally.
Great, thank you very much. We're 10 minutes over time, so we best wrap up. Tom?
Yep. So I just wanted to thank everyone for attending today. One of the reasons we're here is the support of the US Embassy, and thanks to them for that. I should say the second reason we're here is actually part of the motivation of this event was a new collaboration with Leon and Nate at the University of Maryland. So in the first half of 2022, Frank and I will be leading a new project to develop the GCAM Australia model. And very much our ambition is to replicate the type of analysis that Leon and Nate have done for the US. So we're quite excited about that. And so we'll definitely keep everyone informed about when those results are released, and hopefully do an event like this again as well. Do you have anything else to say?
Yeah, and I'll look on behalf of AEMO, thank you everyone for coming, for being with us, and very special thank you to our speakers, and hope to see you again soon.
Thanks so much, it was excellent.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Have a good evening.